Hi, hello everyone. The time for case building is up, and I would like to start the round. Okay, first of all, good morning everyone. Congratulations for making it to the semifinal for the National Schools Debating Championship 2020. Today we're going to debate under the motion of this House would mandate individuals to be cremated upon their death. Judging with me today is me, myself, Jane, Daud, Saliani, Firstolia, Mariah Agnes, Zuhdi, Stephanie, Siagung, as well as Uti. On proposition, currently we have DKI Jakarta and Nusa Tenggara Barat in opposition. Can I know your speaker position, please? You can send it to me through the chat. We're going to start as soon as you fill that in. Who will be your, okay, thank you, proposition? Still waiting for opposition. Okay, thank you very much. Before we start around, just a bit of reminder, please make sure that you time yourself, even though you're not speaking, so you know when is the right time for you to provide POI. I will also time your speech and try as best as I can to give reminders with the chat box, as well as for POI. The default format is through chat. If you wish to be POI via sound or via video, please state that prior to your speech to other debaters. Please do follow the wish of the speaker. Okay, without further ado, I would like to start the debate by calling the Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
Set the If you want the POI, you could just unmute yourself. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. The deceased and their family want one thing, that after death, they're memorized as good and beneficial individuals who don't bring harm to the society. When we actually are able to prove that this burial can manifest to so many harms and prove to you that cremation actually allows better coping mechanisms for the family of the deceased, we win this debate. Our sense of debate is firstly would mandate cremation towards these people because we say that currently burial takes so many land, and with the COVID-19 rising to power, it's able there's like infection probabilities that's high. Secondly, we would subsidize these kinds of cremations, so they cannot say that, oh, cremation is something that's not inaccessible. We say that government would be able to subsidize these kinds of cremation for people that, for example, poor, but for the people that are actually like privileged, it's fine for them, we won't pay for them. Thirdly, we say that currently being buried in itself is something that's already very expensive. Like when we actually have these kinds of cremations, it's easier to carry the maintenance. And also we say that cemetery can emphasize discrimination, that for example, only rich people can pay for the kinds of good cemeteries. That's why we don't want that to happen. Lastly, we're going to work closely with religious leaders, and we're going to like create these kinds of socialization to people, make them understand that this is something that's not a sin, this is not something that's taboo, because currently there are no there's no explicit kind of verse that say, for example, that you being buried or you being cremated is a sin, so on and so forth. First case, why cremation allows better accessibility for family members post-death. Firstly, let's understand about the process of grieving that happens after someone dies. I think that there's two kinds of people. Firstly, the people that's easy to move on, the people that's able to accept that these people are dying and it's okay, we have to move on. But secondly, these people that cannot move on because this death is something that's so sad and they still go to the cemeteries all the time. They're prone to, for example, crying, and they stay in the cemetery for long hours, long moments, because they still, like for example, have this sense of longing towards that person's existence. That's why they go to these spaces. Why do they go to these spaces? Is because they want to feel as if the presence of the person is still there. Like, yes, it is something that's like a burial ground, but the person is down there. I can, for example, communicate the moment, for example, oh, I have a baby, or for example, I have this kind of achievement, or today I'm feeling sad, all those kinds of things. But we say that this is something that's harmful and something that's inaccessible. Why so? Because the moment you have to go to these cemeteries, it's not always accessible. Because human beings have time limit, and human beings also have this monetary and capital limit. Because to go to these cemeteries, you have to provide your time, because sometimes they're buried in places that's far, according to, for example, where the family wants them to bury, and also the capital limit, like human beings cannot always provide money to go to these places. But why is it beneficial when you actually cremate these kinds of people? Firstly, because you are able to keep the person near. So you're able to, for example, express your feelings, like, for example, you feel sad, or I have a baby, or I have an achievement, all those things. You're able to, for example, communicate to this kind of deceased person better, because I've told you the reason why they go to cemeteries because they want to feel as if that person is still there, but the person's just under the ground, for example. But when you're able to keep the person near, we say it's something that's very beneficial, because now we don't allow for these kinds of barriers such as time limit and all those things to actually hamper them from doing so. It's far more beneficial. So we say that this allows better coping mechanism for the family, but once they're ready to let go, you can actually release the ash, for example. So opposition cannot say that, oh, this is going to prolong the feeling of grieving, for example, because you always keep the person near, etc., etc. We say when you're ready, you're able to, for example, release the ash. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why it's harmful, is because burial in and of itself is something that's very expensive. But we have to understand that even if, for example, we've already paid for the burial fee in the first place, we also have to pay for the maintenance fee, right? For cutting the grass or putting stones, all those things, because we want to maintain the burial ground as if it's something that's actually beautiful. It's something that's like a resting place for these people. The thing that's problematic is this is only accessible for these people that are privileged. For underprivileged communities, it's hard to actually have these kinds of accessibility. Understand that it's something that's very expensive. What this emphasizes and highlights, that this actually highlights discrimination, that actually burial ground in which all human beings should be known and should be noticed as the same, because now they're dead anyway, can still emphasize the discrimination. Even worse, death can be a competition ground in order for you to, for example, emphasize who's richer. And this kind, for example, of Asian communities that talk about, oh, I'm able to put this my dad, for example, in San Diego, but this kind of people I can only put in Pondok Rangon, for example. Even death, that should actually be the moment that you don't talk about these things, can highlight discrimination. It's something that's harmful. Yeah. Moving on to my second case, why is it actually justified for the government to mandate these kinds of people? Firstly, I've told you that this is discriminative and this is not accessible for underprivileged communities. We see the government obligation to protect those who don't have these kinds of access, and government's obligation to actually cut off the disparity between the people, ensuring that everyone can feel happy, that death is not actually a competition, that death is actually something that, yeah, it's just like a process that's normal in a human being process, etc. The moment that they're all burnt, you're not going to have discrimination and all those things. Secondly, about religious belief. Why is it justified to contradict with certain religious belief? Because opposition may say that, oh, these kinds of religious beliefs may contradict to the concept of burning someone into ashes. What we have to understand is that all this time, in the past, religion in itself has also interpreted certain kinds of verses and also interpreted certain kinds of, for example, Bible verses. And we say that for example, recently the Pope actually acknowledges the relationship between LGBTQ community, and we say interpretation in religion is something that's completely justified. It's already shown in the past, and religions also do this, for example, in order for them to proliferate and get, for example, viewers. That's why we say that religious beliefs and all those things can still be changed. We can still work with these people, and we say it's still something that's justified because there's no verses in of itself that show and tell you that, for example, not burning someone is actually a sin. And lastly, about freedom of choice. Why is it justified to actually, for example, they want to talk, for example, about this harms the freedom of choice of the people. Understand that freedom of choice can only be tolerated once it doesn't manifest to other harms that can actually be manifested. I'm going to tell you later about what are the kinds of harms. So we say that freedom of choice can only operate if there's no harms that's manifested. And Also, we have to understand that because this is the government duty, government has the social contract to regulate and also like create these rules in the first place, which is also justified. Moving on to my last case about the benefits and why is it important. What we have to understand firstly is that cemetery takes lots of land of burial. This is something that's very harmful because these kinds of lands in the first place could have been used for better purposes, such as school, big, for example, businesses, and all those things. Why? Because buildings can have certain levels, right? But differently with these cemeteries, they can only like have one layer. That's why it would take more land in order for them to actually put these people and fit all these people inside this burial. That's why it's very harmful for you to take so many land. If people in the status quo are angry because of palm oil plantations cutting off so many land, why shouldn't they be angry? Because this is also taking lots of land, and this is something that's also harmful. Moreover, when you actually burn the ashes of these people, it is beneficial for the environment because you can actually, for example, decompose the ashes better, and it's also something that's better for the environment. We want that to happen. Secondly, talking about COVID-19 infections is currently happening. We see it's still very harmful because the moment that these COVID-19 people are still buried, there's still possibilities that this COVID-19 can infect people, right? That's why in certain areas there's discrimination, and they say that, oh, I don't want to bury my people inside these places. We say the moment you actually burn these kinds of people to ashes is not discriminative. It shows to you that there's benefits that people can proliferate, and government has the duty to actually socialize for these kinds of benefits. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for an amazing speech. Next, I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition to start their case.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
If you have any POIs, you can unmute because I won't be reading the chats. Thank you. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe that during the conditions of death, people should have options. The families of these individuals that actually are dead should have the options to choose whether or not they actually want to cremate or whether or not they just want to bury or any other method except. So this is why in Team Opposition, we stand under that stance because we want to appreciate the idea of options that is given to each individual. Before I continue to our team's case, some responses to team government. First, about how they mentioned that religious leaders would actually want to engage with this scenario itself. First, it's not that easy. Even if it is not specifically written in script, tradition has been inside this religion itself. Even though it's not written in script, notice how even the Islamic leaders are buried. They're not burned, even though their script doesn't say anything about them having to be buried. And also note in even the tradition of Hindu itself, where Hindu has taban, but for specific individuals such as babies and etc., it's mandatory in our religion to actually bury them. That shows to you that inside the religion itself, it is not that easy to interfere that much, and it will be actually very hard to do that because there is a very wide community of religion, and not everyone will actually agree to this idea of mandatory cremation itself. So about their idea about grieving mechanism. First, we believe that they are very generalizing because people have very different ways into how they want to cope itself. Some people may feel that when they actually visit the grave of people, they feel more happy. They feel more safe. They feel in a condition where they can actually move on because they actually see proof that this person has already passed away. That will make them eventually move on because they know that the existence of these people are not with them anymore. And some people, as you mentioned, are also seeking closure. Closure is the one that will actually help them move on later on. So we believe that if some people feel more comfortable with having presence of people who are buried, then they should be buried. If people are more comfortable with people being cremated, then they're allowed to be cremated. Yes?
How can you ensure people will make the right decision if grief makes such people so irrational on your side?
We believe that even though people are very irrational, it's still okay because in the end of the day, they're the one who's going to have the consequences of their options itself. And even though if the consequences exist, it won't be very severe later on because what makes people actually crazy is not the idea of whether they are cremated or whether they are actually buried in the first place. It was the idea of death itself. And this can actually be mitigated later on. So we believe that the significant harm that they pointed out that will only happen if people are buried would not actually exist. Second, about the idea of third, about the idea of discrimination. We believe that discrimination is the existence of discrimination here is not very harmful. Notice, because competition has already existed in daily life itself. Even now, where some of our very important leaders are always buried in places that are very more important to actually honor someone. So this shows you that you can actually honor other individuals as a form of that itself. So we believe that the idea of discrimination is not very clear. Second, about benefits itself, how it could be very bad for businesses. We believe that even if there are also land that could have been used before we actually made things for COVID-19 itself. Now notice that there's still very much land inside our society or our country itself, but that land hasn't been used properly itself. So we believe that rather than it's just leaving like that, it's okay for us to actually use it just for burial. And also about composting, we believe that composting for individuals that actually realize people is much better rather than you just compose ash itself. No, thank you. All right, so first, we believe that the idea of death or concept is very important here. Why? Because death is a very bad thing. It hurts. It wrecks the feelings of people who are actually left by these individuals itself. Even death, or some cases, is also viewed as something that is very sacred and monumental for individual. Note how there are very much people who care about death. For example, how last wishes exist for people. And now, in Indonesia itself, there are so many traditions that create death as a very special moment that is very sacred towards many ethnic or tribes itself. Let's take, for example, Toraja, where they want to mummify the people itself, and other scenarios, while Bali, where some also want to mummify their leluhur or other people who are actually related to them to make them feel closure later on. And also how Papua, the idea of cannibalism exists because it's part of their tribe, because it's part of the tradition that existed in them. So we believe that it is not justified for us as a government to actually interfere with these kind of personal beliefs of people, because these are the beliefs that have been implemented for a very long time to them, and it's the right that actually belongs to them. How bad is intervention is? So we have already been interfered by the government for our whole life. Age limit for school, age limit for marriage, where we can actually go to school. They give very limited options for us in the first place. Yeah. And they also interfere a lot in our jobs itself. This shows that the intervention has already been done in our life itself. And we do not want that until the moment of our death, the government would still have control of what we are going to do. Yeah. So to what extent can government actually interfere? First, if consent exists. Second, if this individual actually give direct or tangible harms. We're going to explain to you why consent won't exist in this idea. So consent, the idea of consent is first where family or the closest individual actually allows this action. The idea of consent is very important because families and individuals have the right, because they are very related with the people who actually experience death itself. These are personal rights that are gained by the family the moment their other family members passed away. For example, where someone who just passed away wants to be cremated, wants to be buried near their family itself, or where someone's family wants their family member to be buried in a certain place. This shows you that the idea of consent is very important because this family will be the one who is going to dealing with the aftermath, not the government itself. So this is why the idea of consent is very important. So why is this idea of consent after death is very exclusive? Because the restrictions given when giving is very necessary, because those ones that actually in our life are giving impact. For example, underage marriage has impact. This is why the government can interfere. But if you compare it to that situation, they do not create impact and they don't harm significant people later on. So this is why the concept of death should not be dependent to the government, but should be given to our safety house. So when there is harm, for example, drug dealers, it's okay for the government to actually interfere because they created significant harm. But even now in status quo, government choose to give them back towards their family to let them choose any options. And we believe that this has not given significant harm. That shows you how bad this condition is right now. Let's take the worst case scenario, COVID-19, where COVID-19 can actually spread disease and people are blamed. We believe the government cannot do this. Why? Because the harm of COVID-19 is unintentional. People here that die because of COVID-19, they are victims. They are not the person who transmitted COVID-19, because COVID-19 is a virus that comes and attacks everyone without you even knowing in the first place. Even though these people do not want to wear their mask outside, we believe that they are still victims of the existence of this virus itself, since they are not the creators of this itself. So we believe by this idea of victim itself, we should not blame people and force people to be mandatory cremated just for the sake of this itself. Why do we not want to mandate? Because families, we believe that families should have the option to actually give moments, a monument of this itself. Because families, since handling COVID-19 situation, have sacrificed so much for their families. They have not visited them during treatment because they are not allowed to. We believe that when they are dead, this idea this should be a present that government is actually giving to them for all the sacrifice that they have done itself. We believe that this is a very childish way for the government to actually handle this itself, because the government has failed to manage dead bodies during COVID-19 situation, but just justifies the situation by burning it. There are many other options, such as discussions with the family, and lands that are already buried for where there's already burial for a long time can be gone and made up to a new burial place itself. We believe that this is okay because that has been gone for a very long time. There are many other options, and the option for just opting with cremation itself is very childish and doesn't show the commitment of the government to actually solve the problem thoroughly. We believe that even if COVID-19 situation is fixes, it won't help in the long term or other certain scenarios itself. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for the amazing speech. Next, I would like to invite the Deputy of Prime Minister to continue the case of Proposition B.
Check. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Give me a second. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that burial grounds are extremely discriminative exactly because how expensive it can be for poor people, how they cannot even manifest their best to these people that are their loved ones, knowing that they can compare the burial grounds of them and those who are rich exactly beside of their loved ones. But moreover, on accessibility and environment, we think this is dangerous for the long-term future of countries that like Indonesia and developing countries, right? Because exactly what we want is economic benefits and development, and we cannot just continue this burial grounds norm that we have to maintain in status quo. We want to mandate individuals to be cremated upon their death. If we can prove to you that A, that this will be beneficial for the long term of the development of country, and B, how this will be justified for people to do, we win this debate. I'm going to address 3 points in this debate. Firstly, how choice is important and how choice works in this case. But secondly, regarding environment. And thirdly, how you make grieving worse in your side of the house. First point, regarding choice is important. They told you choice is important because people have different kinds of religions and cultures, right? But we say that's not true because freedom of choice in terms of this only applies if your freedom of choice is not harming other entities. People's freedom of choice in this case to do burials is harming the environment by the hectares of lands used only for totems and people who are dead. This freedom of choice doesn't apply when religious nor cultural ceremonies is dangerous nor harmful to the individuals that is doing the ceremonies and stuff. In instances of burial and cremation, the deceased, and let them rot in the natives of Indonesia, for example, right? But why is it so dangerous? This culture is bad for these people's health, knowing that they can get infections from a rotten body, but just because they're cluttered with the cultural judgment, they let this go and let their people get into infections just because of the rotten body, just because of the culture. This is the government what wants to handle. Because when you are cremated, when you are burnt, there's no chance for you to spread any infections from the rotten body if they're dead, right? But second response, moreover, we think choice is clouded when you're grieving. Your head is filled with despair and sadness and clouds your judgment or any kinds of rationality. That's to say the choice you make is not determined by yourself, but the existing precedent that's burial is the common norm. That means seeking alternative is unlikely knowing it's more accessible. Even if you're rich, you think, I'm just gonna bury them because whatever, it's the choice that I can choose. But moreover, we say choice only exists if you're rich. That's when you have enough money to maintain the burial grounds. Poor people are forced to let go of the awful burial grounds as they cannot afford to for like the maintenance costs. That means opposition team is alienating the most important actor in this debate, that is the global poor. Meanwhile, side proposition sides with the poor. We acknowledge their grievances. We give them access to cremation, knowing that it's only inside a pot and they can bring them home. Never have to like compare the differences of social class in the cemetery, for example. So choice sides with a side proposition. Regarding second point, or environment, there's no response coming from the first speaker regarding environment and how dangerous it is. People can be really mad when you use environment to destroy environment for infrastructure projects, for example, right? Or when you destroy environments for like palm oil plantation. But we question, why is it justified to destroy environment for people who are dead? Meanwhile, these infrastructure projects and like all of these projects that's created by the government is created for the people's benefits in itself. For example, like you're going to create businesses or you'll create infrastructure project like toll roads in Papua, right? That's to say it's going to give transportation for these people who don't have access to electricity or water. This is more beneficial than building environment, like destroying environment for burial grounds. That's not functional for a lot of people, because the burial ground is only functional for the people who is related to the family of the dead. But then, do you agree if government opens spaces for palm oil plantations and infrastructure projects, right? But we say school, businesses, infrastructure is much more functional than to those who live around those buildings. But thirdly, you sacrifice poor people's living to create more space for burial grounds. When you can create businesses for poor people, you can create living like jobs and job vacancy for these people, and so on and so forth, right? So their best case scenario will be people can grieve and have choice, but you destroy the choice of poor people to work and like create working from the infrastructure projects that can be used in this burial grounds, for example, right? But our worst case scenario will be that sure, people can be like sad that they cannot bury their family, but sadness is insignificant to comparatively to the living to the poor people that can be used in the infrastructure projects above this like future burial grounds. Yes, VOI.
Making infrastructures or other businesses is very complex. It's not just based on the land. Many lands exist now, but we can see not many schools are being built. How can you ensure with the existence of land from burial, as soon straight away infrastructures will go up?
Exactly, because when you use the land for burial ground, you cannot use it for anything else. If you like take away all of the bodies, it is unjustified for the government to do so, right? People will protest. Why do you take out the bodies for infrastructure projects? So if we never create spaces for burial grounds, for example, then we can like use it for infrastructure projects. We don't necessarily need to remove these bodies anymore when this is important. It's going to be more unjustified in your side of the house when government realize, oh, I can use this land for hotels or hospitals, right? And then they suddenly remove all these bodies. This happened in Indonesia before, and the government keeps doing it, and so on and so forth, right? So on environment and cases of living conditions, we're winning in this clash. But third point, you make grieving worse in your side. Why? Because in your side of the house, death is a competition. Why? Because the last thing you can do for your deceased loved ones is to give the best, even on their death, right? Giving the best ceremony, giving them a really good prayer and whatnot. Unfortunately, when you're poor, when you grieve on a cemetery and you see the burial grounds and totems of the dead, you can see others of the totems that are rich, for example, that's built with marmors, that's built with ceramics, there's beautiful writings, and so on and so forth. You see that if you're poor, you cannot do your best to build those things because it's really unaffordable and expensive to do so, right? You're just leaving them to do so. For example, you don't have like grass or beautiful grasses in the sun. But why is this harmful? You feel like as a poor, you cannot do your best to make the burial ground beautiful for your loved ones. This is going to be a long-term regret of your life, knowing that you can do your best for the loved ones. So for example, like your parents, knowing that you cannot do your best for your parents, for example, like even in their death, you cannot make them like the ceremony beautiful, or you make the burial beautiful. Will be really a really bad memory inside their brain, for example, knowing that they cannot provide the best kind of burials to their parents, knowing that like the ceramics or the marmors is broken, or knowing that the burial is drowned in a flood or something that's happening in Tanah Kusir, right? You can see how badly it is, because now they have no choice but to let go of these burial grounds that it's already awful. They cannot just suddenly take out the bodies and cremate them, right? So we want to mandate cremation. Why? Because in this case, the cremation, you can bring it home. You can you can put it anywhere you want. You can bring it to like a vacational home, for example, when you're old. You can go and live in in Indonesia, for example, and still know that you can grieve for your loved ones, knowing that they're not going to live. Moreover, you make grieving better. Why? Because this cremation is going to be more accessible. You can bring it everywhere. If you have to move out from Indonesia and like your parents are buried in Indonesia, it will be really hard for you to go back to Indonesia every month when you want to pray for them, right? Or when you want to visit their like cemetery, right? In our side of the house, when cremation is like more accessible and you can bring it everywhere, you can actually grieve and go to vacation home. You can be alone and not be bothered by other people, and you can hold it in your hands. You can hug them. It feels like they are beside you, for example, right? We think this kind of grievances is much more important. Why? It's not that we're generalizing people grievances. We say that grievances are subjective, but we say that the more like the closer you feel with the death, with the deceased ones, the connection that you have with the deceased ones will always want to be. This is proven how by people are sleeping in the cemetery just because they really miss the people, right? So with the cremation, it will be easier because they can bring it to their room. They don't have to necessarily sleep in an open space. They can have their own safe space. They can have a really beautiful grieving. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for the wonderful speech. Continuing the case of opposition, I would like to call upon the leader of opposition.
Okay, wait a second.
Yep.
Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, in a word that the government side of the house broke, is not morally justified. Because when you are mandating people's choice, culture, and belief into one mandatory options, and you are harming the freedom of choice of people and how they want to express their grief, since their belief and culture of people is diverse. So that is why in our side of the house, when we are not mandating individual to be cremated and only give it as an option, that is when in the end of the day, the choice of the people will not be violated. And you will be seen as a good government towards your society. Before I continue to my extensions, I would like to give some response to the government side of the house. Firstly, they're always bring up about the COVID-19 case of cremations, but the problem is like when you're mandating this policy, this means that you are mandating it to everyone, and you don't even explain on any parameter on why and how this cremated should be mandatory, ladies and gentlemen. Because like if it's only COVID-19, then it is only like a momentum actions, and by being buried is also justifiable and not cremated in, because like when the body is dead, the virus will not be spreading again from underground, ladies and gentlemen, because it will also disappear for a few hours or few days, for example. And that is why it is okay to not cremating them, because like when you every time the COVID-19 case does, like you're always cremating them. That means that you don't give any like significant problem to handling this COVID-19 these problems, and you don't giving any sense of memorable from the family that is lose their family, for example. And second of all, they are giving idea of how this create poor people like living land and infrastructures and so on and so forth. But ladies and gentlemen, it is a stupid escaping from the government about infrastructure, because when we are talking about land, the government have already considerations on how they will build infrastructure and land will always be exist for infrastructure, because our government is smart and for handling that. They will searching for any other way for looking for infrastructure and how these poor people will always get work and so on and so forth. And see from the news where Indonesian government had also provide 1,000-hectare acre of land just for the burial of the COVID-19 case deaths, right? So it shows to you that how is the government is not really worrying about land, and how this land is land and infrastructure problem they bring by the government side of us will not gonna work at all. No, thank you. And second idea is they bring the idea of moving on, because but ladies and gentlemen, the idea process of moving on is when like they do not leaving any regret from the family that they died, for example, how they are having such as a memory after their person dead, they can like share their sadness or etc., ladies and gentlemen. Because when, as the scenario that you brought, when you are moving to a foreign country, for example, at least when they come back, they still have any memorable place when they can express their
express and like meet their family and so on and so forth. And that's why the idea is moving on in our side of the house, it will be better rather than the government proposal. Two things that I'll bring in my extensions. First of all, on how is this mandatory is a sadistic action from the government, and second of all, why is arbitrary from government is bad. First of all, how is this a sadistic actions? Ladies and gentlemen, with every diverse kind of society that is spreading around the world, with the tradition and culture that they believe, it will be also a diverse way on how they express that. Because the way people value death is different. For example, first in Hindu, when crematory or ngaben is being amended where they believe that by that way it can send the soul into heaven. Second of all, in Muslim, where people receive the different point of view, where if they've done crematory, it will be too sadistic for them because what they believe is not that way. Plus, like in Muslim, for instance, they've been a majority in several countries, and see how bad in the end they will respond to government because it has been backlash with their beliefs from decades and so on and so forth by you mandating them by doing this crematory. Third of all, in Toraja, there's a culture where actually they celebrated death by keeping the dead body in sequence of years they take the body out and make up their body and change its clothes, and how they perceive death is to commemorate the body of soul of their ancestor. So from these differences and perspective, we can see on how diverse is the death point of view from the people, and how we have to provide preference as a good government to actually give a consent towards those people and family on how will they perceive the death of their family members. It can be the way on how they memorize their family, for instance, or it can be like when their family is buried, they believe that they can visit them anytime, and they're also
POI.
will not being a sense of regret that can be happen before the person is dead. So people still can visit them or value them and so on and so forth. So the consent and option is very, very important for them, because the movement that when we mandate it is violate the right of the people to express grief because the body can be valuable for them, and it is morally justified. Because for the belief they've been preserved the culture and the tradition, the grief, and you as the government need a valid reasons and urgency on why you should mandate people to cremate, and that will be never morally justified, and your urgency like is not enough. So it is wrong. And also yeah, before I continue, is there any POI? I'll take your POI.
Knowing that dead bodies are adding up every single day, do you agree that environment will be sacrificed for these dead bodies?
We think the environment will be okay if we bury the body, because the government have like several, because like the land still exists, and the government already have a way and plan on how to handle the land or control the pace of society growth and birth, for instance. And also in a sequence of time, government have their way on how to circulate these lands and etc. So environment will be worse in your side of the house if you like cremate all of this body, and like every time a much amount of body you cremate them with that diverse kind, and how many deaths if you cremate them, this will worsen the environment because like the pollution will increasing, right? And how this will worsen in your side of the house about the environmental, and in our side of the house this will be more beneficial in our environment if we're not mandatoring them and still giving option for the family to bury the body of the dead. And second of all, why is arbitrary from government is bad? Firstly, because the one who laid to handle the body is the family from the dead person itself. And by a proposal, by mandating, it is not justified because in mandate mean unnegotiable and do not giving any negotiation for the family on what is their consent or what is their consent on how their family member will be handled after that. Second of all, if you reject the consent by arbitrary actions, it is not justified because what if the cause of the death is caused by the government itself? For example, in COVID-19 pandemic, where during the handle of the patient cannot be seen or visited by the family, then after their death, you don't even give the family sense of memoriam and the tribute on their family. So how cruel you are as the government to violate the options of your society. So in the short term, not mandating them will not causing any protest from the society, since the one that own the body is the society itself, the family itself, and in the long term, discrimination will not be exist, so people still can preserve their belief and the option still exists. So in the end, it will not make you seen as a bad government. So the freedom of choice and option of the society is important in emotionally and morally. So that is why we should not mandate our society, because like about the case government, how if they're poor and don't have money, because in not mandating them, it means that we still can have a discussion with the family on how the death will be treated. For instance, we can be sharing payment from the government and the society and etc., or the family or the government can cooperate to subsidize and where they will negotiate to where they buried the body or and so on and so forth. And that is why, for those reasons, for the sadistic actions and more morally unjustified, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful speech. I would like to invite the last substantive speech from Proposition. Government Whip, you may have the floor.
Am I audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it was awfully convenient of team opposition to be dismissive of our team's main premise when it works for the case by saying that land still exists, or that, oh, they try to co-opt our benefits by saying we can still subsidize these for poor people. We told you that land right now operates on a system of land scarcity. Don't let them fall for their benefits that can only happen on our side of the house. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First, is it morally justified to mandate everyone, and particularly about the grieving process that team opposition never actually dealt with. And the second thing on development of land and how we use land. This is the more important clash, but I'm going to be charitable and deal a lot with their first premise. Before that, several pieces of clarifications here. One, we're not doing this only in the COVID-19 context. I think it was clear coming from my first speaker speech. This is a weird straw man. What we're saying is that COVID-19 is a particularly important context that is relevant right now that team opposition must engage with when COVID-19 cases are literally soaring and you have to defend burying all these people, meaning that you can never build the schools that you want to champion on your side of the house. But secondly, there's no particular country context in this debate. So even if we agree that Indonesia has lots of land, I think team opposition still needs to engage in a country like Hong Kong, for example, that has low amounts of land. That means you can never co-opt our benefits of like giving a lot of land, etc. Right? So first clash then on is it morally justified and on the grieving process. The biggest premise coming from team opposition was that we need to give a freedom of choice to people who are giving, right? Who are grieving. First response, freedom of choice is a very weak principle here because opposition never sufficiently proved to you as to why this freedom of choice was an objective benefit to all these people. The freedom of choice was going to be oppositional to people in the environment, for example, to people who are more poor and need this land for development, etc., to the livelihoods of other people on the ground. This is why you see a lot of small villages near burial grounds, for example, because the expansion of these burial grounds are entrenching towards these sort of areas, entrenching towards the villages in which these people live in. Hence, what happens on our side, the comparative is that you have a balance of rights. You still allow individuals to access some form of grieving. We're not going to deny them grieving at all, but more importantly, we give them a balance by saying that we don't assault the other people's rights for government's land development, etc. The biggest flaw in their case then was to prove why this method of burial were exclusive ways to get over grief. When they say that other methods exist, it is unclear to me what is the marginal benefit you get on their side, but I'm going to be charitable and I'm going to show why it becomes way worse. But secondly, note that team opposition never sufficiently proved to you why this freedom of choice was going to be so legitimate. Why are they not? Because individuals who decide right now in status quo are in a status of grief. Crucially, their support system is likely to be in the same mindset of being irrational. That means individuals are unable to weigh ultimately which method of grievance will be best for them. But we told you that grieving on their side of the house was actively worse because individuals who feel a sense of crushing and crippling guilt, because on their side, it was unclear to me how governments are going to have enough capital to subsidize all the burial grounds. Because realize what status quo looks like. that within burial grounds, there's a massive disparity of like the totems that are in the burial grounds, for example, right? That you have headstones that are very fancy, for example, but the same headstones that are broken, the same one that has grass that is just all over the place. The problem then is that burials are not accessible, that you need certain types of maintenance. What is the impact of this disparity and discrimination? You entrench the type of guilt for poor people even more, because you as a poor person now see that you are unable to enshrine your father in the flowers of burial, that you are unable to give him the best what you want in your final goodbyes. But why are they the most vulnerable individuals? No, thank you, that you should care about. For so long, they have been disadvantaged in the past, living stressful lives, and ultimately, it's part of the government's fault as well. For example, not give them education. This type of grief is probably a big shock to them when they see their mother, who has worked so long hours to give them a good standard of living, and now that person is ripped apart from them. These people are people who are likely to go over the edge, where this grief is going to be the push for them to resort to horrible pieces of grieving, for example, such as drinking to numb the pain. The alternatives are much worse on your side of the house, because you entrench these people who are already on the edge even more to resort to other things, such as drinking, such as harming themselves, such as being guilty and crying over it and never actually moving on. This is the tangible effect that you get under team opposition, and this is why they lose, because you're actively complicit in further harming these individuals when the grief has already taken so much of their lives. What did they respond to this? They say, this is fine because they will be the ones who face the consequences. This is abhorrent because you're allowing certain types of individuals who have been failed by the government to now suddenly be more pushed to the edge, to not let them allow some sort of good breathing. The next thing that we get, like in the last 30 seconds of DLO speech, was that we can still give them sharing payments, we can still give them subsidies. But crucially, this is a weird attempt to co-opt our own benefits, because the cost of maintenance is so costly on our side. The reason why we are able to subsidize cremation is because after that, you don't have to have it for the next 20 years and to maintain that sort of dust for the next 20 years. You can't take any of our benefits, don't try to. The next thing coming from then was how we have tradition and religion and personal beliefs. I think to some big extent, this is already largely mitigated by the fact that we have socialization with religious leaders. And we give you like lots of precedences in the past, that Pope Francis, for example, is becoming more friendly to the LGBT community, that he's willing to change, that even organized religious structures are willing to co-opt this if they see a certain benefit by the government, for example, right? That Maruf Amin is already saying that even if the vaccine is not halal, we should still do it for the greater good of the people. So this by itself already mitigates all of the harms about tradition and religious and personal beliefs. But we say that it's okay to deprioritize certain tradition and religions. Let's bite the bullet here if they don't really want to be charitable on-site opposition. We said it's okay the moment that, one, you're not actively letting these individuals harm themselves by pushing them over the edge, but you're also benefiting other individuals on the ground who have way bigger capacity, and government has way bigger stake in them on their side of the house. When they realized they could not win this clash, team opposition says backlash. I don't see why such a backlash should be so significant, because these traditions are small number of people, as opposed to the livelihoods of people who are, one, still alive, that you still care for, and you are dependent on the government ultimately. The last thing they wanted to say here was that we need to have some significant type of consent. We say that consent only applies the moment that you don't create a more harm to the people. Now, in the COVID-19 context, it is okay for us to cremate, for example, and other places to cremate, because COVID-19 does give a tangible harm that team opposition can never disprove. But even if all our claims about grieving were not true, even if this clash I was horrible at rebutting this clash, in our best case, we show you how grieving was going to better. But in our worst case scenario, the effects of grieving is symmetrical, ladies and gentlemen. Individuals who are likely going to clutch to the memories of loved ones will do on your side. This shows that all of opposition's claims are less important to the benefits of having more land on our side, allowing some form of religious opt-in should be way less. So let's go to the more important clash on what happens to government responsibility. I want to note that the only thing coming from them was that governments still have much land. This is just not sufficient at all. This is empirically untrue, because burial grounds are becoming more expansive. If you use land for one purpose, you cannot use it to make schools on your side. The context of COVID-19 burials is especially true the moment you have to expand more, the more people are dying. With no particular context, they need to engage with their worst case scenario in places like Hong Kong, when there's no land, that you have to have more burial grounds. let's engage in our best case scenario when there's lots of land. At least we don't actively reduce that land by making more burial grounds. We can actually focus it on making education if that's what you really want. We are the government in this case. We can do that on our side. But crucially, you can only build schools, you can only build infrastructure if land exists, and that's what you do get under their side, and that's why you lose.
Thank you very much for the speed. Next, I would like to call upon opposition with to close on the case.
Uh, Sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, then. Yeah. I would like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels notice on how government's main point is only because of the accessibility towards the grievance itself, right? Notice notice on how important these funerals or these burials towards the society itself, right? Are willing to cash in many kind of money. So the moment when you are forcing them to actually cremate them when they are dead, people will think that they will regret in the future that why can't I give a good funeral or a good burial towards my family or towards my loved one? Because notice on how these family or these loved ones are very important towards them. They want to give the best towards them because they are no longer in the whole wide world. So the idea of longing will be worse on their side of the house because society will feel that they are wrong, that they regret that not giving the best towards their loved one when they are dead itself, right? And then even if they bring the argument of that these kind of pots can actually be taken away or bring to other places itself, we believe that those kind of things doesn't actually matters because notice on how the idea of hope towards these dead people that they are in the world right now, that they are helping us or they are between us, it only happens when you are lost, when you don't have any kind of hope in the whole wide world. So you don't actually have to grieve all of the time, right? You only grieve for some occasion itself. The idea of that they can take this spot towards many places is not that impactful at the end of the day, right? And then notice on the idea of environment. Panels, if you really want to talk about the idea on environment, notice on how environment be can also be worsened on the side. For example, like when you're cremating, you're burning them, right? So this also creates pollution and etc., right? And also on the idea of bringing the idea of Hong Kong itself, right? Notice on how you cannot generalize Hong Kong as your main starting point, right? Notice on how there are also other countries that have bigger lands, that have more lands. For example, India, Brazil, China,
UI.
and etc. Right? So that is why we want to give the freedom of choice towards these people. If they don't have enough land, it is okay for them to actually not do these kind of things, to actually cremate them. But if they have the capacity, we are allowing them to do those kind of things. So the idea of Hong Kong, which have less land, cannot be generalized on their side of the house. And notice on how notice on how if the land is less, this can also provide a warning towards the government itself, right? Notice on how government will actually realize that there is less land, that this COVID-19 is an urgent matter that needs to be solved at the end of the day, right? Notice on how government will actually try to push their people more to actually start wearing masks to actually stop the spreading of the COVID-19 itself, making the government having more urgency, and at the end of the day, making the recovery of the COVID-19 itself better. And notice on how they want to actually change these burial grounds to making infrastructure. Notice on how this is a bad effect towards the society. Notice from the moment government is trying to monetize the death of people, not to sacrifice others suffering for only for money. This is very unjustified, because notice on how death is a very sacred thing. You cannot buy death with money. You cannot buy life with money itself, right, ladies and gentlemen? So the moment the government is actually trying to destroy these burial grounds to stop people burying their loved one, is the same thing as to actually sacrifice. It's the same thing as government is actually monetizing death and making people that think that government doesn't actually understand the value itself, right? That is only a business model from the very beginning. And notice on how that is something that you can't negotiate from the very beginning. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, notice on how what my first speaker stated, that for example, just like for example, if you do criminal, you still get the body towards your family. Notice on how that these people, even though they are not the COVID-19 victim itself, it's still a victim, right? They are a victim of death itself, right, ladies and gentlemen? They are not the ones who created death from the very beginning, even though they are created death. In the status quo right now, governments still give these people, these families, to actually have a chance to actually do whatever they want towards their body itself, right? And then, so from the very beginning, the idea of human rights is better on our side of the house, because when you try to actually force someone to force a victim to actually be cremated, that is very, very unjustified, because that will only make people be more angry, because they feel that they don't have any kind of choice in their side of the house. Notice when in a world where you don't have any choice, it is very, very harmful, right? Because notice on how not every country has the same conditions as Hong Kong itself, right, ladies and gentlemen? Not all places actually have the places to actually have the capacity to actually cremate these bodies itself, right? Notice on how countries, for example, have many pollution. There's on how many pollutions, and many people actually
Yeah.
have the ability towards to actually do this burial stuff, right? No, thank you. And notice on how and notice on how people in Hong Kong from the very beginning actually have the consent itself, right, ladies and gentlemen. And then on the idea of discrimination, we believe that discrimination can still happen on their side of the house, because notice that burial is not always about when the moment you make them go to board itself. There's also celebrations, right? So the idea of discriminations can still happen on their side of the house. For example, when they say on our side of the house, there are more fancy tombs or totems. An example on their side of the house, they, for example, can be a bigger festival for the loved ones when they died, or for example, that the place where they actually do this where they do actually do this cremation itself is a more fancier, or the pots where they actually give these kinds of ashes is actually made out of gold or more expensive materials than the other people itself, right? And notice on how the idea of accessibility about people, not all people actually have the capacity to do this burial stuff. Notice on how governments also can propose on subsidize. We believe that subsidize can also be achieved under our side of the house. If government said that they want to subsidize lower income people to actually to for them to actually have the ability to 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 do this kind of cemented itself, we believe that that can also be happen on our side of the house, right? Because notice on their proposal that it also takes money. So the idea of money can also be achieved on our side of the house. It is not mutually exclusive on their side of the house, because on their side of the house, the idea of money can still happen. And why you should go for team opposition? Because in team opposition, we also understand that there are some places that don't have enough land, that don't have enough capacity to actually do this. But we are giving as team opposition is the freedom of choice. If you want to actually bury this person, bury that. If you don't want to, you are allowed not to do those kind of things, and that is why we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speech. I would like to invite the opposition reply speaker to the stage.
Am I audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
Going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are three main caches in this debate. First, about the idea of grievance, which one can actually which method can actually give the best coping mechanism for these individuals who are left by their family. Second, about the idea of land. Should it be used for infrastructure, or should it be used to make burials or etc.? And second, about the idea of which one can actually solve the problematics of COVID-19 situation better. First idea about grievance. They mentioned to you about how what they want to achieve is people to let go very easily later on, for people to actually feel better later on. We agree that this is also what we want to achieve, but the method that they propose to you is how they want to cremate people later on, saying that through cremation, this can make people move on later on, because it will be because these people would not have a certain monument or certain place, but they can feel later on. But notice that later on, their second speaker mentioned that how they want to meet them every time by bringing their ash everywhere. This backlashes the idea of the moving on that they actually wanted to bring in the first place, showing the inconsistency of them and the idea of grievance itself. Even if we're going to count that, the idea of grievance is much better in our side of the house, because we have managed to characterize you that there are various people that have very different coping mechanism itself. We have showed to you that actually giving options for people such as burial and etc. would be much better, because we are actually giving people options to choose which one can make them feel better later on after these people have died in the end of the day. So the idea of grievance and how it can actually make people move on later on, which will be much better on side opposition. Second, about the idea of infrastructure, whether we should use it for the idea of land, whether we should use it for infrastructure or for land itself. They mentioned that the problem that exists now is because the land is now used for burial so much that we cannot manage any other infrastructures like that. But we have actually POI by asking that how can you assure that with this land that exists now, infrastructure will also go up, because we have explained how complex it is. But they never responded to that, because we have already characterized you now that there are so many lands, but infrastructure is not getting forward. But then they also came up with the idea of environment that backlashes the idea of infrastructure itself, and infrastructure is not in line with environment itself. So we believe that the idea of both making the environment better and for the using of land itself is much better on our side of the house. Since we have options, we're not making everyone just do burials, because there is still the idea of cremation and other method that is more suitable for these people itself. About the idea of COVID-19, and also they mentioned the example about Hong Kong itself. But we have mentioned to you that Hong Kong has actually consented and has to do this because of circumstances. This is an example that cannot be brought to this debate, because there are many other lands and they cannot generalize that the only option available is countries like Hong Kong itself. So we believe that the idea of options still exists here, and the idea of consent is also very example, because we have characterized to you how important consent is from these individuals who are being left by their families itself, even in cases of they giving harm, such as COVID-19 situation. But they brought the idea of COVID-19, but we have given these rebuttals by mentioning that COVID-19 is not going to cause many more transmission, since we have managed to explain to you that the virus die as soon as the people die. So the idea of getting transmission from COVID-19 through burial, like they explained, would not exist. Second, about the idea, but they never engaged in the idea of intervention that we have mentioned to you. We have characterized to you step by step why people would not actually want to choose to be interfered through these very personal methods, such as the example that we brought to you, Toraja and etc. This shows to you that the idea of intervention is not allowed to do, and it's much better in our safe house, with the idea of consent being very important. And about solving COVID-19 situation itself, we have mentioned to you how cremating people would not actually solve the problem of COVID-19 itself. But we have also managed to mention to you that by burying, it will create a sense of for the government to a sense of knowing that the land is already gone and that they have to push harder to make this COVID-19 situation solve in the end of the day. So we believe later on, from the factors given infrastructure and COVID-19 situation, it is much better on side opposition. And TB is proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lastly, I would like to welcome government reply speaker to close the debate.
Am I audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's a shame that opposition have been really ignoring any kinds of benefits and harms that we provide to you because of the lack of lens existing in status quo. They have been really dismissive to this case. We think that their engagement have failed in this debate. But moreover, if side opposition failed to explain that A, somehow freedom of choice is valid, and B, that this will be a good beneficial way for people to grieve, they cannot win this debate. Moreover, I'm going to talk about three questions this way. Firstly, why government have the right to mandate. Secondly, the development of land. Thirdly, on grievances, right? First clash, why government have the right to mandate. My first speaker told you that three things. Firstly, like we want to enfranchise the poor living condition by giving them like infrastructure projects to give more access to jobs and welfare benefits, as simple as electricity, right? Like we want to create like a better living condition for the people who live around these areas. No response how suddenly opposition will protect them or like mitigate any harm that we brought to you. Secondly, Jere told you that freedom of choice doesn't apply when it harms yourself and other entities. Also elaborated by my second speaker's speech. When you told them it's okay to sacrifice land, when I told you there are native people who actually rot their bodies and let them infect people around their villages, how these people let these bodies like infect these people and harm themselves. But thirdly, we told you that we will make grief cheaper because people don't have to burden to take care of the maintenance cost of dust, right? Compared to like the burial grounds that needs like ceramics and all that beautiful grass and whatnot. Their only case is cultural differences that minority of people compared to the majority of poor that's disenfranchised in this debate. It is insignificant for them to be championed in this debate, but moreover they told you on how free choice and consent, right? This exists in our side of the house because like they have choice where to bring the grief, like for example, to where to bring like the cremation dust and whatnot. However, they responded things like our arguments by downplaying our layers of analysis of inaccessibility with we can subsidize everything. Exactly because government can only subsidy to the extent that the body is buried in status quo. The money in status quo used to subsidy burial grounds will be used in our side of the house to subsidy cremation. That's why we don't give like maintenance costs, for example, right? Moreover, on the right to mandate falls into our side of the house. Second clash on development of land. We told you that we don't want to sacrifice environment, not because of like pollution and whatnot. We told you that the land is very important for spaces to be used for functionalities. This is extended from first to third speaker. We say that this is very important because poor people need this more than people who have dead bodies, right? Their only response is yes, land exists. This cannot like substitute to our analysis of why land is so scarce in the status quo. Where we crystallize, this is crystallized, and we told you three things. Firstly, government are sacrificing people's home and living resources for the land of the dead bodies and villages, for example, right? But secondly, this sacrifice functionality costs that might be more beneficial if the land is used to make functional infrastructure projects like school, hospital, and businesses, right? But thirdly, we're operating on less scarcity like Indonesia and Hong Kong. They've been really dismissive to these cases. But moreover, the third speaker brought a new material of pollution. However, this came too late in this third speaker. We cannot respond to this at all. They don't even accept our POI. Moreover, it's more unjustified inside opposition when government try to take out bodies from the burial grounds for infrastructure projects in Indonesia. This is extended in my second speaker's speech. When government realized that this land is potential to function as living resources for the people around that area, there's no response coming from side opposition. Development land still stand inside of the house. Third clash on grievances, right? We told you that grievances will be more accessible for 4 reasons. Firstly, the presence of the person is there when the dust is beside you. Secondly, you can bring the dust literally everywhere you want, even if you leave your village or like whatever. But thirdly, you can keep the person near your personal space. But fourthly, you can grieve in your own personal space that you want. You don't want to be like in the outer space of like cemetery, for example, right? There's no response for them why sudden grievances like these are not important inside opposition. Moreover, they negate it by people can use traditions and ceremonies, but they never explain why it's so meaningful and important for grieving through ceremonies, when my previous speakers have told you that these ceremonies are used to show off that your death ceremony is better and fancier than the others, making death as competition. First speaker told you, third speaker told you. Moreover, they told you that this can happen in our side. Moreover, however, we have crystallized this when we told you that grief are more cheaper inside of the house. They don't have to compete to each other. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the debate. After this, the judge will deliberate for a while. Please get back to the main room. Congratulations for finishing the round. You can virtually shake hands, pause for wave to your friends, and I'll see you as soon as I can.